So here we are. You decide to click on a video with the phrase Jiggle Physics in its title. Hey, I can't judge. I made the video. I'm making it right now. As silly as it might sound, though, I think there's actually a lot to be said about the jiggle physics in Stellar Blade, and how the game's main character, Eve, is presented. Before we go any further, though, this is going to be another video that's not safe for work, like, for real this time. Here we go. There's been a complicated and nuanced conversation surrounding Eve ever since Stellar Blade was first revealed back in 2021 under the name Project Eve. Eve is a well-endowed woman? I really hate the way that sounds, but I'm gonna kind of have to tiptoe around some things here as to not anger the fickle YouTube gods, so I guess we're all just supposed to make our peace with that. Anyway, Eve is very busty, thick, as the kids say, and Shift Up, the developer of Stellar Blade, has made that very clear. The jiggle physics are on full display in all of the trailers. The game allows you to wear a skin suit that essentially makes Eve naked, and the studio announced that it scanned real-life Korean model Shin Jae-eun as the body model for Eve. It's no secret that Eve's body is meant to be a selling point for the game, on par with its flashy combat, but that idea, using a woman's body as part of marketing for a game, feels very outdated in 2024. That's not to say that liking Eve's body is wrong, per se, but given how much progress has been made in the way that video games present women over the past 10 or even 15 years, it's no surprise that Stellar Blade has rubbed some people the wrong way, while rubbing others the right way. I wish I did not say that like that. A phrase that's gotten thrown around a lot when talking about Stellar Blade is the male gaze. It's in the title of this video and in a fantastic article by Issy Velde on Inverse titled Stellar Blade and the Male Gaze. We'll talk about that article more in depth in a little bit, but I just wanted to get out in front and say that I've been working on this video with this title since March, so please, nobody sick H-Bomber guy on me. The Inverse piece is excellent. Like I said, we'll talk about it later. It's worth reading after this if you haven't already. We go in different directions with the topic. Doesn't matter. Anyway, the male gaze is essentially a way of analyzing the portrayal of women in media. It was coined in 1973 by Laura Mulvey in an essay published in 1975 titled Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, and argues that the male gaze is one of the lenses through which women are viewed and objectified. That the male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure through their presentation on screen. As the Inverse article points out, it does not mean that sexy women equals bad. It's much more nuanced than that. It's a concept that Stellar Blade is an excellent example of with its presentation of Eve. Take a look at the initial reveal trailer for the game from 2021 and pay close attention to the way that Eve is represented. Alright, full screen it. Let's begin our analysis. The very first image we see of Eve is her bent over with the camera positioned below and behind her. She jumps into action and the camera follows, still highlighting her legs and rear. We get a better look at her full body as she stabs the monster she's fighting for just a moment, and then she's thrown off. The camera follows and does a slow-motion swoop behind her, not showcasing her violent determination to kill the beast, not telling us anything deeper about what's going on in the scene or her character. Remember, this is the reveal trailer for the entire game, but instead, sliding up her legs and around her butt as she clambers to her feet, bent over at the waist yet again. 4 seconds later, we get another slow-mo shot of Eve being flailed around, this time seen entirely from below with her legs spread wide. This portrayal of Eve is pretty typical in most trailers for Stellar Blade. It's not difficult to see how the camera work puts her body first, above all else when it comes to telling us what this game is actually about. First and foremost, Eve is a body, not a person. The most essential definition of objectification. We don't even get a good look at her face in the reveal trailer until 35 seconds in, after we're already well acquainted with her posterior. In fairness, this is just a trailer though. The argument for Eve's objectification here still stands, but let's just be real, it's not the game. Unfortunately, however, Shift Up isn't beating the objectification allegations there either. Let's take a look at the way Eve is introduced in the opening scene of Stellar Blade. The first thing we see of Eve is a very tight shot of her mouth as she screams out, "No!" In another life, I was an incredible voice actor, okay? The shot highlights her lips. We catch a glimpse of her hands for a moment as we switch to a temporary first-person view, and then she's rescued from her drop pod, pulled out by a friend where we get the real money shot of the opening cutscene. Eve's nearly naked body, oiled up by a liquid that apparently filled the pod she was in, hoisted out of the wreckage in super slow motion as a ship explodes in the sky above her, her body on full display, bent so that we don't see her face, but we get both sides of her rear and both breasts in frame, an almost impossible contortion. Just like in the marketing materials, Eve's body is what's really important. Her sexuality on display through her lips and body, before we even see her face. Why is she all wet when she comes out of the pod? I'm sure there's some sort of narrative explanation, but the real reason is so that she's all oiled up and glistening for the first time we get to see her. It's her body that's prioritized. It's the star of the show, not Eve. The male gaze has been written about a lot since the 70s, and conversations surrounding it and video games aren't new. However, one topic that I've had a hard time finding anything extensive about is the relationship between the male gaze and the controllable cameras in games. At its core, the male gaze is about how cameras can display women through a heterosexual male lens. But does that lens dissolve when the player is given the freedom to move the camera wherever they like? Yes and no. That answer is a little frustrating, I get it, but here's what I mean. When you're actually playing Stellar Blade and not in any cutscenes, you're able to move the camera wherever you want. So there's an argument for saying that there can't be any intentionality to Eve's sexualization through the camera in any sections where the player has control of it. While I do agree that the intentionality of the camera is lessened during gameplay, there are still some design aspects that make the game part of the game very male-gazy. For example, when you're running around, players will usually have the camera positioned behind Eve. That in itself isn't anything exclusive to Stellar Blade, that's just how all third-person action games are. However, the game constantly has Eve running uphill, meaning that the camera will likely be positioned by most players behind and below her, highlighting her butt as she explores. Looking back at the intro to the game again, after you finish the tutorial fight section, you have to run uphill, avoiding explosions for like a minute straight. As I said, the camera doesn't have to be placed there, I guess, but if you want to see where you're going and not get killed, players will be incentivized to keep Eve's rear front and center. A similar effect happens as a result of the light that comes from your little flying robot companion. This game wants to be Nier Automata so bad. We will talk about that in a little bit too. Peter, I hear you ask, how does a flashlight play into the male gaze? It's just a light. That's a good question, but the answer is pretty clear as soon as you examine what the purpose of a flashlight is in real life and how that differs from how it's used in Stellar Blade. Okay, this is going to feel a little obvious, but come with me here. When you're using a flashlight, like in real life, you want to shine it directly at the thing you want to illuminate, and you don't want anything large to be in the way because it'll obscure the light. In Stellar Blade, the robot is usually positioned behind Eve, shining the flashlight partially on her, obstructing the view. So why do this if it's super impractical? Well, because it highlights the curves of Eve's body. It makes her look all oiled up in a lot of her outfits and reminds us that she's sexy, which remember, is one of the main points of the game. The camera isn't able to male gazeify her when the player has control, but the game's presentation can. What's funny is the reflections on Eve's body happen regardless of if the light is behind her or not. Shift up, guys. Just make her all shiny. We don't need this facade of, well, it's actually the light from the robot. It's fine. Your game is horny. The justifications just feel really insecure to me, you know? All right, the jiggle physics. It's hard to know what to say about this other than the way this girl's boobs move is borderline hysterical. There is no movement too slight that doesn't make them jump and bounce and ripple around like a waterbed. Zooming in on the pause menu, jiggle. Falling to her knees as she soaks in the devastating loss her army is facing, you know she's jiggling. Climbing up a ladder, jiggle fucking city. And here's the thing, our skin moves, right? Jiggle physics outside the video games exist. However, not like that. Women's bodies don't move like this, even women who are well endowed. That phrase didn't feel good to say the second time either. When you look at Eve's body just undulating around, it doesn't look like skin, it looks like water. The effect is applied to her entire body. You can really see it when she's climbing up a ladder, and it's odd, you know? It's not realistic, but a woman drawn and animated like this isn't trying to be. She's meant to be sexually appealing to straight men. That's the male gaze. Those jiggle physics highlight her most sexualized body parts, even in times when the emotional stakes of the story are high and it feels a little inappropriate. I used it as an example earlier, but here Eve is falling to her knees, overcome with emotion due to the loss her side is experiencing, but they made sure to bounce her boobs around for like an hour as she does it. The jiggle physics are an ever-present reminder that Eve is not a person first, she is a body. Her jiggling transcends all reason. Take a look at her here with a leather jacket. Y'all, leather does not move like this, not even a little bit. If you're struggling to understand the concept of the male gaze, which is okay, it's a critical lens that can be difficult to grasp at first, the jiggle physics are a clear example of it. Think of how Adam, one of the male characters in the game, is presented. He doesn't jiggle, not even for a second, even though I'm a guy, I jiggle. So by the logic of the game, he should too, right? He doesn't though. He just gets to be a guy, a character, a person, while Eve isn't. In the inverse article I mentioned before, Issy Vandervelt points out that ShiftUp confirmed that Shin Jae-yoon, the body model for Eve, was only used from the neck down, and that Shin didn't provide any facial performances in the game. Dr. Matt Denny, a television and film professor for the University of Warwick, told Inverse they didn't choose an athlete, or a martial artist, or even an actor. You don't want Shin as a performer, you want her from the neck down. It seems to be very much a statement of the parts of this woman that are of value. ShiftUp posted a video of Shin being scanned for the game, which then immediately cuts to a render of Eve. Now, this is just how I see it from the angle that this video was taken from, but to me, it looks like her body isn't even perfect enough for the game. When it cuts to Eve, you can see that her thighs have been made thicker, her breasts even fuller. I don't know, doesn't it feel odd that the person that Stellar Blade director Kim Hyung-tae chose to be the most attractive looking body for the user still wasn't good enough? So let's talk about Nier Automata. I was waiting for you to ask. With the backlash surrounding Eve's over-sexualization, a lot of people point to Nier, specifically 2B, and say, hey, if Stellar Blade is being criticized for being so male-gazy, why does Nier get the pass? It's got a sexy lady in a non-practical maid outfit, and there's even a trophy for looking up her skirt. The answer is kind of complicated, but one side of it is simply explained by saying, yeah, that's a really solid criticism of the game. The male gaze can definitely be felt in certain areas, like the upskirt trophy and how the camera positions itself low to the ground behind 2B when you sprint around the world. That said, the argument falls apart a little bit when engaging with what the game is actually trying to say about 2B and her agency. I'm not going to explain every detail of that here, but you can read more about it in an article titled 2B and the Male Gaze, posted to Medium by Moses Nassar. I don't agree with every point Nassar makes, especially when comparing Nier Automata to Bayonetta, but it does a good job explaining how Nier subverts some of the male gaze expectations that its initial presentation might suggest. Nier isn't the only game that people point to when they push back to the pushback, and I'm not going to break down every game here because I just don't think I need to. Instead, here's an overarching answer to help understand it that, unfortunately, might be a little unsatisfying to some, but it's worth explaining just a little bit. The portrayal of women in games, as is the case with all representation, is nuanced, and some people will find some portrayals to be good and tasteful, while others won't. Bayonetta, for example, is another game people point to as a sort of double standard when it comes to discussions surrounding Stellar Blade. Some people are critical of Bayonetta's over-sexualized presentation, but others find the fact that she owns her sexuality as a part of her character to mean that she isn't being objectified. So who's right? Well, both people.
I feel like a fucking celebrity in this town.
When it comes to interpreting works of fiction and applying different lenses to them, there's room for multiple findings. That's a tough answer though, believe me, I get it. I like to know when something is correct, but when it comes to nuanced topics in media, everyone will walk away feeling differently about it. Now, there are incorrect ways to interpret things. Don't get me wrong, people sometimes make up their own evidence or disregard things that are in the text of a game when building an opinion, but as long as you're trying, it's valid to understand things differently from others. So, does playing Stellar Blade make you a bad person? No, of course not. Liking Eve and how she's modeled and animated doesn't make you a bad person either. I just want to drive this point home a little bit more and say that I personally really like Eve's character design. I think a lot of the outfits in the game are really stylish and cool, and the game itself is super solid as well. So please don't hear this as some sort of condemnation of the game or anyone who plays or likes it. That's just not what this video is about. But I do think it's important for people to understand why Eve's portrayal is controversial, and why it feels so outdated. Socially, women in games have made some huge strides to be better represented over the last decade or so, but Stellar Blade is a major step back with the way that it reduces Eve to being nothing more than a walking jiggle simulation. Back in 2013, the Dead Island Riptide Collector's Edition included a 12-inch bust of a headless, armless, bikini-wearing dead body, which was immediately criticized for essentially doing the same thing that Stellar Blade is. What's the point of this bust? To just be boobs. There's no human identity tied to it, it's just boobs. Now, there's more nuance to Eve as a character, and it would be disingenuous to say that there's nothing to her outside of that, but you can understand the comparison I'm making. That kind of treatment was inappropriate back in 2013, and it's still inappropriate now, 11 years later. I'm not saying Stellar Blade is bad. I think it's a decent action game, and I'm definitely not saying that you're bad if you like it. Talking about the male gaze in gaming isn't a condemnation of anything, really. I've seen threads online of people being irritated when the conversation topic comes up, but I personally think it's a good one. It's just a way of understanding and analyzing games and the way that they feature women, and it's a really good way to analyze the way that a game treats its women. Stellar Blade doesn't treat Eve very well, and that's kind of a shame since it's otherwise a solid action game. Think of it like this. Looking at games through the lens of the male gaze isn't about saying that characters like Eve or even Bayonetta are bad and that anyone who likes them is bad too. Instead, as Dr. Matt Denny told Inverse, it's not about making games less sexy. It's about making games more sexy for more people. That's why the recently revealed cast of Hades 2 has garnered so much thirsty attention. To quote Issy Vandervelde one last time, "Sexy isn't bad. Pretending there's only one type is." Like and subscribe.